Members of the media, can you hear me? Good morning again. Is everybody from the media able to hear me?
Yes, sir, we are.
All right. Not seeing them on the screen.
Allegiance at home and abroad, and all those tuning in. Welcome to today's virtual press conference hosted by the Right Honorable Prime Minister. Today we'll give you an update on the state of the nation during the COVID-19 pandemic. Ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister of Belize, Right Honorable Dean Barrow.
There clearly is some feedback, so perhaps somebody has not muted his or her mic. Can we sort that out first, please? We're good to go now? Okay. Well, good morning, members of the media. Good morning, members of the public, my fellow Belizeans. Welcome to this morning's press conference, and forgive me, but I must start this morning on a small note of complaint. Today's press conference is another in what has become a regular almost weekly series. The objective is always to update the nation in as comprehensive a manner as possible on where we are in the ongoing struggle to keep our country free from the novel coronavirus. I try, by way of these briefings, to speak to both health sector and economic sector developments. I always come to you armed with material from Cabinet and from the Apex National Oversight Committee. My aid in addressing you and answering your questions is the official notes of the deliberations of both bodies. Those notes help me to report accurately to you, since, for the sake of transparency, fidelity to the record is essential. I was therefore distressed to learn yesterday that someone, not the official minutes keeper, had circulated his or her own version of the NOC discussions and decisions. That was wrong and a breach of confidentiality. Furthermore, the error was compounded by the fact that what was released was, in a number of instances, terribly inaccurate. I express the earnest hope that it won't happen again. Turning now to the Ministry of Health's coronavirus dashboard. You all know that we continue to be free of any active case. I therefore offer the customary but always heartfelt thanks to all our essential workers. As of Wednesday, we had done 1,517 tests. There were 5 results still pending, with all others being negative except for the 18 you have long since known about. We continue to test on an average of 3 times per week. The fact that now we don't test as often as we once did has nothing to do with what that distorted report falsely described as a decision to conserve on supplies. Rather, it is that all the science, according to our Director of Health Services, proves that in our current circumstances, testing asymptomatic people is a low-yield exercise. Accordingly, our present test level is entirely satisfactory of World Health Organization standards. On the economic front, you already, I believe, have the press release sent out yesterday updating the status of the unemployment relief program. This shows that 43,726 applications have been approved to date. SSB has processed all those approvals, and 94% of 40,927 of them were successfully paid. The rest is so far unpayable because the bank information of the applicants was either not submitted or the information they sent was inaccurate. Regarding the food assistance program, these are the numbers. 46,686 households have been helped, and now the on-the-ground assessment has been completed in 38 rural villages in Toledo, Cayo, and Orangeville. Those people are beginning at this point to be helped. Concerning what we are expecting from the international financial institutions, it is true that we are still in waiting mode. It is not true, though, that, as the inaccurate so-called notes state, no international funding will come in for the month of June. In fact, the first disbursement of the US $6.2 million from the IDB is to arrive right after the bank's June 3rd signature of the amended loan contract. The other IDB line of US $12 million is scheduled to be approved formally on June 20th, and the processing of the World Bank's $21 million is also to be completed in the latter half of next month of June. There is US $50 million more to be had from the World Bank, but those particular disbursements indeed won't happen before July. Now, Wednesday's meeting of the National Oversight Committee did agree with Cabinet on the further easing that is to take place as internally we proceed with the reopening of our economy. In dealing in some detail with the relaxation of the state of emergency measures, I sound the usual caution. Please do not interpret the further lifting of restrictions as a free-for-all. I get it that people are stir crazy, but we cannot afford to move too fast. I therefore ask again for strict observance of such safety protocols as do remain in place. The amended SI to reflect the changes is being drafted. In fact, I believe the AG and his Solgen finished this morning. I was sent a copy, but I have not had time to check it. What I tell you then is subject to changes, albeit at the most slight changes. In any case, that amended SI would take effect at 12:01 a.m. this Monday, June 1st. By that I mean that when you wake up Monday morning, the SI would be extant and would usher in the following. The number allowed for gatherings with social distancing will increase from 10 to 40. In particular, our places of worship with the requisite space will be able physically to host congregations of that size. Tacos and other street vendors can get back to business, but will need to comply with certain sanitary protocols. Those protocols are being finalized and will be handed to those who have emerged as the leaders of the street vendor community between today and tomorrow. The permission to operate already given to open-air restaurants will now be extended to all restaurants. This again is on condition that the physical distancing and other rules will still apply. The sale of Bolido, much anticipated at least in some quarters, will restart, and casinos will also be allowed to reopen. Neither smoking nor alcohol consumption is to be allowed in the casinos. Approval is being given for gyms in accordance with the strict guidelines ratified by the NOC. In accordance with those guidelines, gyms can now reopen. All non-contact open-air sports are to be permitted for practice and exercise purposes, and in fact, exercise hours are no longer restricted to the 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. time slot. Sport fishing is also allowed. General curfew hours are being broadened only for Fridays and Saturdays. Thus, on those 2 days, curfew will be from 9 p.m. to 5 a.m. All other days will remain at 8 p.m. to 5 a.m. The children's curfew stays generally at 6 p.m. to 8 a.m., but minors can move about from 5 a.m. up to 8 p.m. on weekdays and 9 p.m. on weekends if and only if they are accompanied by a responsible adult. As a result of those unofficial leaked NOC notes, much confusion has arisen surrounding the holding of graduation ceremonies. The true position is this: both Cabinet and the NOC received a proposal from the Belize High School regarding a particular mode for their particular ceremony. Acceptance of the proposal would have meant agreeing to breach the numbers cap of 10, now 40, on gatherings, although both Cabinet and the NOC felt that what the Belize High School was proposing could be safely done. There was also, though, a worry that permission to BHS could be seen as preferential treatment. Ultimately, the NOC asked that the Ministry of Education consult with all the principals of our high schools. The ministry is to find out how the other high schools are planning graduation ceremonies that conform to the social distancing protocols and what the other principals think of the BHS proposal. There is thus no effort to impose any one-size-fits-all template on the high schools. This is an information gathering exercise that will help in making a final decision regarding BHS. In fact, just before I set out this morning to come here, I had a message from the Minister of Education, and if I can recollect correctly what he told me, it is this: all the principals have their individual plans for how they will conduct their graduation exercises, their graduation ceremonies, but they all say that they are doing it in a way that will conform to the social distancing requirements. They say, again as I understand it from the minister, that it is fine then for Belize High School to proceed on exactly that same basis. We will distill this information at Monday's NOC meeting, but I gather that the BHS principal has already been informed of what the result of the minister's consultation with the other school principals is. With that, I conclude my sketch of the new rules, allowing me now to come to that extremely important matter of the reopening of our borders generally and the PGIA in particular. Of course, the Attorney General will tomorrow, is that correct, Audrey? Tomorrow at 3 p.m. Take to the Ask the Experts program, and in what is his now customary fashion, go through the SI line by line for the benefit of the public. Take the final position from him, because as I said, I have, in talking to you now, not been able to go through the draft, and so what I am giving you are the highlights, which won't change, they might be added to, but remember that I content myself with just this sketch of the major points constituting the changes that the SI will promote now. So, this question of the external reopening. I make clear at once that an early loosening of the entry prohibition at our land borders was never on the cards. That is because in only the last week, the number of COVID-19 cases has surged in the countries surrounding us. Mexico went up by 25%, from 56,000 to 75,000. Guatemala by 80%, from 2,200 to 4,000. Honduras by 50%, from 3,000 to 4,400. El Salvador from 1,600 to 2,100. In the case of Mexico, questions have arisen as to whether there is underreporting. That notwithstanding, Mexico is now globally the 17th most infected out of 200 countries and territories. It is in that context that we agreed that there would likely be a considerable wait before we could unseal our land borders. On the other hand, there has been the most anxious, searching, and intense debate at both the NOC and Cabinet over a possible standalone reopening of the PGIA. It is no secret that we have, since around a month ago, been aiming for a July 1st recommencement of operations at our only international airport. Indeed, by majority vote at both the Cabinet and the NOC, the decision was made to confirm that July 1st date, subject to certain conditions being put in place. It surely is not hard to understand why we so ardently wished for a go at the PGIA. Tourism is our largest job creator and the biggest contributor to GDP and foreign exchange earnings. In 2019, for example, total tourism expenditure in Belize was $502.3 million US. But COVID-19 is decimating the industry. The devastation is such that between January and April of this year, tourist spending in Belize fell by $82 million US over the same period last year. And until the PGIA can reopen, it is only going to get worse. I don't see members of the media in the picture. I take it that all is still well, so I continue. Now, even as we pushed to reopen, we had to bear certain facts well in mind. With regard to international travel prohibitions, the US decision to ban Chinese visitors from as early as January of this year was widely applauded. At its peak, though, only 82,000 of 1.3 billion Chinese were infected, and Chinese visitors to the US represented just about 3% of the US's total annual visitors. Yet the US proceeded with its embargo on Chinese travel to America. Currently, the US also bans visitors from Brazil. 320,000 Brazilians are infected out of a total population of 210 million, and Brazilians represent just 4% of visitor flows to the US. In our own case vis-a-vis the US, we had to reflect on the fact that there are 1.8 million Americans infected. A third of all COVID-19 deaths are US, and that country is the source of 75% of our visitors. So the US, in circumstances of a relatively minuscule visitor flow from Brazil and China, nevertheless froze all travel from those two countries. The logic for our initial proscription ban on travel to Belize from the US in the context of their world-leading infection rate and there being our 75% source market is thus clearly irrefutable. That is why our drive to reopen the PGIA had to be subject to our doing our absolute best to mitigate the undeniable and serious risk of imported infections coming from any resumed flow of US visitors. Accordingly, the decisions of the NOC and Cabinet re the PGIA were premised on our first putting in place a comprehensive set of protocols to govern reopening. The centerpiece of this is to be a testing requirement. Now, it is a fact that reliable rapid tests, on which I personally had pinned a lot of hopes, are not currently available. Our only recourse was thus to go with the PCR tests that currently both we and the US use and which are the WHO gold standard. What we decided was that US and other visitors would be able to come to Belize via the PGIA on one principal condition. They would need to present upon arrival a negative COVID-19 PCR test result, and they would need to have obtained that negative result no earlier than 72 hours before traveling. We checked via our embassy in Washington and our consulates in Miami, Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago on the ease or otherwise of getting tests in the US in preparation for travel. It became clear that the processes differed widely from state to state and even among different counties in the same state. Still, the requirement for travelers to test remained a sine qua non for us as we sought to protect our coronavirus-free record in the midst of any external reopening. We therefore informed via the Belize Tourism Board the airlines of this condition that would attach to travel from North America to Belize. They did not object, and the information was that they would still be prepared to come. We therefore appeared all set to confirm this morning our July 1st PGIA reopening. Alas, what the poet said about the best laid plans of mice and men proved only too true on this occasion. Yesterday, IATA, the International Air Transport Association, sent a message to our Director of Civil Aviation. That message made clear IATA's disapproval of the Belize travel testing requirement. According to IATA, that could not work now, and Belize should wait on the development of a reliable rapid test that would allow for the airlines themselves to administer a pre-boarding test. After that, the dominoes started falling. The carriers changed their tune, and it became clear that they would not fly to Belize if we insisted on travelers coming armed with a negative test result. I repeat, though, that our paramount safety concerns mandate our holding firm on that requirement. Long story short, I am, in consequence of all this, today unable to confirm July 1st as a firm reopening date for the PGIA. If IATA holds its position that is seemingly mirrored now by the airlines, we will not be able to reopen until there is mass availability of approved rapid tests. Now, of course, in the meantime, if there are charter carriers that would want to come to Belize on condition that their passengers would in fact be able to present negative test results upon arrival, we would reopen for that sort of a purpose. But generally, because of the position now taken by the airlines, there cannot be the hoped for reopening of the PGIA on July 1. Of course, there are already rapid tests on the market, but not with the needed degree of specificity and sensitivity. Everything suggests, though, that rapid testing nirvana is imminent. And the moment that happens, we will be good to go. Having not, in view of the position taken by the airlines, having not been able, though, to secure July 1st, you will understand that I don't feel comfortable hazarding a guess, an estimate as to the actual new date. We therefore take it one step at a time with the commitment continuously to update you as the situation unfolds. I close with one assurance. GOB is working with the DFC on funding tourism sector loans at concessionary rates as a stopgap until the sector can return to strength. In other words, in this, as in all other things, we, this country, will come through. Given how well we have done in containing COVID-19 everyone surely knows that this note of hope is not at all misplaced, but absolutely and completely justified. Thank you, and I'm certainly now prepared to take your questions.
Okay, thank you, Prime Minister. We'll now take questions from members of the media. We'll start with Leticia Guerra from Vibes Media. Unmute your mic, please.
We're not hearing you.
You have to unmute your mic, Leticia. Can you speak?
Hello?
Yes.
Yeah, we're hearing you now. Well, interventions have already commenced. The unemployment relief program and the food assistance rollout. Those are interventions designed to do two things, to try give people the kind of assistance that will allow them, however marginally, to try to make ends meet, and also will mean that consumption, which clearly has fallen off dramatically because of the factors that you enumerated, can at least get that very small fillip in consequence of the government bailouts. As we continue to open the economy further internally, again, that should mean some people going back to work, and that should mean an increase in earnings. We talk now about the casinos. They employ a lot of people. We talk about the street vendors. We talk about several other areas of enterprise. So once we continue along that path, that will provide some additional lift to economic activity and some additional stimulus, however minor, to consumption. And you're perfectly correct. An increase in consumption is absolutely necessary to keep things going. Insofar as the public sector and government being the largest employer in the country, so far as that is concerned, I repeat my commitment that I will do my level best to ensure that there is no cutting of the substantive salaries of the public officers and that there is no retrenchment. Operationally, you're right, the shortfall in government revenues has to mean some kind of a contraction in terms of the services that government provides. We're trying to do a balancing act. For example, there are these internationally funded infrastructure projects. They do require a degree of GOB counterpart funding. We want to see how, no matter what the circumstances, we can continue to juice a little those programs, because you're talking about employment on the infrastructure projects. You're also talking about the inflow of foreign exchange, because these are principally foreign funded projects. So altogether, while the situation is grim in Belize as it is everywhere in the world, our plans assure us that we will be able to make it, we will be able to come through this, perhaps bloody, but with our heads absolutely unbowed. Thank you.
Okay, unfortunately, lots of people will be back, so we'll move on to the next person. Oh, actually, she's here. Sorry. Go ahead, Leticia.
Hello?
Yes, please.
Hello?
Yes, go on.
And my second question is, as foreign exchange earnings continue to fall as we enter the latter part of the year, when banana prices fall and the citrus and sugar crop end.
No, we can't hear the rest of your question.
We have not.
The entirety of your question. Could you repeat?
Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, there seems to be some technical difficulties. My question is, as foreign exchange earnings fall as we enter the latter part of the year, when banana prices fall and the citrus and sugar crop end, and your administration policy of domestic borrowing accelerates, further rising monthly budget deficit, how do you and your team of advisors calculate the risk of devaluation of our currency in light of this new economic environment we are living in today? Is it going to be inevitable that our cost value due to the persistent trends created by foreign currency?
Absolutely not. We are confident of one thing, if of nothing else, and that is that we will maintain the peg. Your question presupposes a continuing, endless, limitless downward spiral, downward trajectory. I think that's a false premise. That's a false assumption. We, without now wanting to put a firm date on it, are absolutely confident that we are going to reopen for tourism. I don't want to talk about the outermost limit of our tourism reopening, or I didn't want to, because I don't want to send the wrong signal. But let me take the plunge. There is no way tourism will not be back by November 1st. I personally anticipate that it will restart long before November 1st. But if November 1st, by November 1st, something has to give. If not, as a country, we will have to contemplate the possibility of reopening, even if we don't have the reliable rapid test kits that we are so earnestly hoping for. The position is that we can't take the chance now, when it does appear extremely likely that if we wait another month or so, we will be able to get the rapid test kits. We certainly can't take the decision now to simply reopen, even absent a rapid test kit. But if that's the decision that confronts us still in November, then rubber will meet the road, and we will have to do what we have to do. In other words, I don't think it will ever come to this, but assuming the situation presents us with this stark choice, take the chance, although once we put in place all possible measures, we can minimize the risk, but take the chance that there can be a return to some degree of COVID-19 once we reopen to the exterior. Take the chance of running that risk, or face the inevitability of our almost literally dying because of the absence of tourism and because of the absence of the earnings that we need for consumption, among other things, to stimulate consumption and to keep body and soul together from local economic activity. So it's a false position, in my view, to talk as though what is happening now will continue completely unabated and will perhaps be exacerbated the longer we go. No, rather, the opposite has to be true. That the longer we go, the closer we're getting to finding a reliable rapid test, the closer we're getting to a vaccine, although I don't think that is anywhere near as close as the rapid test is. But with the entire world in overdrive to find health sector solutions to this COVID-19 pandemic, this is no time to preach or engage in any counsel of despair. And so I have every confidence in saying that we will not reach the rock bottom that you project that would raise any specter of any kind of devaluation. That is not on the cards. In terms of foreign exchange and where we are now, government has its plans. There are the central bank reserves ultimately to backstop what the commercial banks have, and we have our plans as to how, in fact, we would be able to boost the foreign exchange situation. I don't want to get into the details right now. We're still finalizing with the central bank the initiative that we're going to launch, but I can give you every assurance that we will not, going through to the end of the year, absolutely not completely run out of foreign exchange. Ain't going to happen.
Thank you, Prime Minister.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll now move on to Jules Vasquez from Channel 7.
Yes, hello.
Morning, Jules.
From Channel 7. So first of all, Prime Minister, you spoke about the specifically message on IATA. Obviously, for the state include government happened in early July. With America.
Sorry, you're breaking up, Jules. Can we try again, please? It's the technical difficulties are intervening. That sounds better. That sounds better.
Yeah?
Yes, that sounds better.
All right. So, yes, Mr. Prime Minister, you discussed the issue with the news from IATA, and you know the fragile states of being in the tourism sector right now. You know that many of the investors and property owners and resort owners are at the thin edge of the wedge. And your announcement, based on information from IATA, that the airport can't, for any practical purpose, open in early July because there will be no flights. It will send people inevitably running for the exits, layoffs on a large scale that hotel owners have been trying to forestall. Layoffs will inevitably ensue at the hotels, at the large hotels, and at the airport even, one foresees, because they can only hold on to staff for so long with no revenue in sight. Two things arise. Will the unemployment assistance program reopen? That is number one. Number two, will the government speak with commercial banks or make some line of financing available for these hotels, resorts, tourism interests that are trying to hold on to an extremely difficult time when they've just run out of money.
First question, absolutely yes. We are having some difficulties with the unemployment relief program, as I alluded to earlier, having principally to do with the lack of information or accurate information submitted by some participants or would-be participants in the program. But we've only spent, as a consequence, something like $11 million, I believe, to date. Remember that we borrowed $75 million to fund the unemployment relief program. I did take 10 from that 75 to start the food rollout, but that is going to be reimbursed. So we still must think in terms of a $75 million pool for unemployment relief. On that basis, absolutely, with the additional layoffs that we will see now, the unemployment relief program will have to continue and perhaps be expanded. To complete the picture, remember that the unemployment relief program is attempting to take care of those recently unemployed, but it is also attempting to take care of those that have been longer unemployed. I can see, without wanting to discourage anyone, that there may come a point at which the longer term unemployed, people who can't offer any kind of social security particulars because they have not been working for a very, very long time, I can see how we might run into some difficulties sustaining that element of the unemployed. In a way, harsh though it may seem, this is a country that never ever was able to boast full employment. So undoubtedly, like the poor, some unemployed will be with us always. So getting back then to the essence of the answer to your question, yes, those newly laid off that are not yet in the unemployment relief pool will be able to gain entry, and we can continue the unemployment relief program for as long as it will take for us to reopen tourism. Remember, I am making the point that at some juncture, tourism will have to be reopened, even though it might mean, I don't think so, but it could mean running what some people would see as heightened risks. If we face that choice, we will simply have to do what we must do. And then in terms of the assistance that's going to be needed in the meantime for the tourism industry, I said, I think perhaps before you joined the meeting, when I was doing the introductory remarks, that we are already working with the Development Finance Corporation to identify funding for the tourism sector. Now, what Mrs. Goff from DFC, the general manager of DFC, told me is that there is already a CDB line that we can use. The interest rate is going to be the difficulty there. She was to send me all the particulars, but she wanted to wait until she had had her board meeting, which was to have taken place yesterday. So I expect that I will get the details today or very early next week. I will then get in touch with the president of CDB, since this is a CDB line, to try to negotiate a lowering of the rate. I can tell you this without wanting to prejudge how that conversation will go. By hook or by crook, we will make sure that the current rate will, in fact, the current interest rate will in fact be reduced. That's with respect to the DFC line. There is also an EIB, European Investment Bank line, that again is not specifically tailored to include the tourism sector, but can be expanded. Now, the problem with that line is that the Europeans are only prepared to provide 50% of the funding for projects that would qualify for approval under that line. They talk initially about things like going green, like solar panels and that sort of thing. But again, Mrs. Goff's initial conversation with the EIB provides hope that they will agree to an expansion of the program's remit, and that they would also agree to perhaps go as high as funding 75% of projects that would qualify. Here again, it is incumbent on me to get involved, to become part of that conversation with the EIB, so that, again, the question of the expansion of the program, the casting of the net a little wider, so that the tourism businesses can assuredly get in, can be dealt with. I don't believe that the interest rate there is as high as the interest rate on the CDB loan. But once more, if that is a problem, I have my own assurances based on my examination of the issue with my team that we will be able to do something about the interest rates.
When you're talking about it, if I could put a follow-up, it's a tough time. It's something like 6%, not 8% or 5%.
No. I saw something from.
Well, let me not call any names, but something from, if not it might not have been the BTA, it might have been from people in the industry who are saying they need a 5 or 6% rate. Now, the problem with the DFC is that no doubt CDB is lending to the DFC at just about that rate, and when they add on their administration charges, that's what takes you up to 8 or 9%. 5 or 6% is what the industry can live with. I am telling you that in terms of that DFC line, I will get it down to 6%, hopefully 5, but certainly no higher than 6%.
Okay, if I could move on to the next subject, which is education. So much psychic energy and so many hours of education have been spent on this. One is inspired to think that it seems so little has been given to the process of education as earlier report, as anxious, searching, and intense. I don't have the feeling that there have been this type of anxious, searching, and intense conversations about reopening schools. One, I'm not an expert, but we know what's happening in the world. Schools are reopening, there attempting to open under new conditions. Yet, it seems that there is no urgency, and it would appear that there are major losses being experienced by children, a lack of comfort, especially younger children.
No, my sense is that, well, when I last spoke, I had said it struck me that we would not be able to reopen schools until the start of the new academic year in August or whenever that is. But I left it for the Ministry of Education to decide. I don't know if any formal announcement has been made, but more and more, I think the Ministry of Education is coming to the realization that schools will indeed not reopen until the start of the new financial year. You're telling me about schools reopening all over the world. That may be in the States. That's certainly not what's happening. That's not what's happening in the Caribbean, because the minister was able to update us on the plans that are being made with respect to CSEC and CAPE, when those exams will now be taken. because of the difficulties in all our CARICOM, well, I say all, I don't know if there is an exception or two, but in the main, all the schools in our jurisdictions are in fact not reopened and seem to be resigned to the possibility or the inevitability of the reopening being delayed until the start of the new financial year. So we're not in this alone, and to the extent that there must be the sitting or the sittings of the exams with respect to CSEC and CAPE, plans are in place to deal with that. That in fact, there is now the summer holidays coming hard upon us, and so the period during which children would have been out of school would be long extended. Again, that is the byproduct of the pandemic. In my own case, SCA, where my daughter is a student, continued with the online classes and had determined to do so until the scheduled end of the school year. They had to announce that it stops today, so the last 2 weeks have been locked off, and it is because they're having great difficulty in getting students to log on to participate, and that's no doubt for all sorts of reasons. People, you talk about access to the internet and having to pay for bandwidth and all that sort of thing. But my point is, Jules, that while it is extremely regrettable, so is everything else about COVID-19. And it is absolutely fair to say that this is a matter that has exercised the Ministry of Education and by extension the government of Belize, but what it is what it is.
If I could simply as a follow-up, I understand what you're saying, that it is up to your decision or the LOC. But it appears that if not now in this 6-week respite period right now, then when? Because inevitably a second wave will come, and at some point it appears, and I understand your technical decision this way, but it appears that there is not spirit to say, okay, well, we cannot try something in an isolated place. Can be the benefit as kids come across, can be the result kids come across, but perhaps we can do in ABC pilot school, the Belize district or in San Pedro. I'm saying that it's a priority, and unlike tourism, it's insular. It does not require people to come into the country.
Well, listen, I will leave that detailed discussion that you obviously want to have about education and what is happening for another time when you and the minister can go at it one-on-one. I do know that, for example, with respect to IT vets, where you can't have online training because it must be hands-on. You need to see that people are learning to weld properly, and the instructors must be there to oversee them. Certainly, the ministry came up with a notion to use classrooms in Toledo, for one, to facilitate that sort of thing. Point being that I do not accept that there is no creative thinking being engaged in by the Ministry of Education, but I am ill-equipped to debate this with you from any position of strength, because the particulars of what the ministry is doing naturally are best known by the minister and his officials.
Okay, understood. Those being my two questions and two follow-ups. If I could ask a third about the economy. We've seen the latest assessment from the SRP, and it's a fourth quarter contraction and quite severe contraction. And we know that the forecast for the rest of the year is very grim. And more significant, it's actually the largest prediction forecast in the region. I think that for the 2020 year, the lease is forecast by 12%, while the national average 5%. I'm saying we are not in the same boat as everyone else to be in the boat that's taking up the most of us. People know what are the factors in that. But if you just speak in general terms about the four success of contraction, and very likely, inevitably, of it, the lease is in a very severe recession. And it is akin to the Great Depression of 1930.
Well, I myself have said that, so it's not as though you have been struck by any sort of epiphany. I think we all know what the position is. But again, I need to make clear that certain fundamental pillars will not be interfered with. The principle of those being, we will continue to pay our public officers. There will be no retrenchment. There will be no cuts in salary. You look at what's happening in St. Lucia, look at what's happening now in Barbados, where both of them have proposed, both governments have proposed to their public officers that, listen, we will cut your pay insofar as the cash element, what was previously your entire pay going to you in cash, now you will get 50%, or you'll get 25%, or you will get 60%, and the rest of your pay you will have to take in bonds that can only be redeemed at some point in the future. There is no plan in place where this government is concerned to do anything like that. And as long as we can continue, however we manage to do so, as long as we can continue to pay our public officers, that in itself will mean that the absolute heights of the unemployment flood inundation won't completely swamp us. It will mean that there is still going to be some level of consumption. And as I said, tourism apart, the rest of the economy, the private sector areas of the economy are slowly reopening, are slowly trying to come back to strength as we relax these measures and we try to in fact stimulate activity. So indeed the situation is dire. When you talk about the regional projection for GDP declines, I don't know if you're talking about Central America, or you're talking about the Caribbean, or you're talking about both. It doesn't help. And so let me not pursue that line. Otherwise, I would have said, I am sure I can find countries in the Caribbean that are so much worse off than we are. The question, for example, of the airport reopening, Antigua and St. Lucia, both, as we did, said to the airlines, we want you to come. They both fixed dates, I think Antigua perhaps even earlier than July 1st. St. Lucia perhaps July 1st or just before. But they asked for it to happen on the same basis as we did, that the passengers would have to come armed with a negative test result. They naturally were told the same thing that we are told. In the case of Antigua, as I understand it, so desperate is their situation. They're so much more dependent even than we are on tourism, that they are actually contemplating going with a rapid test that we in Belize at this juncture will certainly not look at, because the rapid test clearly is unreliable. I have the literature here, you know that Abbott Labs, big time, huge conglomerate, they were given by the FDA emergency authorization to, in fact, use the rapid tests they had developed. There was a study done about a month after this commenced, and it showed that you were getting 48% false negatives. But I talk about what Antigua is contemplating doing to underscore the point that there are those who are in a worse situation than we are. But let's not get into any misery loves company kind of exposition here. Our situation is undoubtedly bad, but I insist that slow and painful though it may be, we will get back to strength, and the recovery will have to be led by tourism, since that is the largest contributor to our GDP. I repeat, therefore, that something will have to give, that I am waiting a little bit longer as I am forced to because of the airline's decision. I believe that a rapid test that's satisfactory is very much in the works, but ultimately, if we end up being forced into the same situation as Antigua is contemplating, we may have to take our chances with what there is. The bottom line, to reiterate, is that this cannot be allowed, talking now particularly about tourism, to extend beyond a certain point. What we would have to do if we reach that point of do or die is not something we do now, simply because it is not yet do or die. It may be close to it, but it is not yet do or die. And so we can afford, as has to be our first option, we can afford to say, no, we put safety first. We put health first. We have this enviable record of containing COVID-19. I think our population is well pleased with this. We do not run the risk of provoking a second wave, of provoking a cluster outbreak that would be caused by imported infections. Not at this juncture. Time may well come when we take that risk. That time is not now, and in my estimation, that time will never come, because we will be able to get out of this by way of a rapid test that's acceptable. Not foolproof, none will ever be foolproof. We will be able to get out of this by way of a rapid test that's acceptable within the next month or two.
Okay, we'll now move on to Paul from Plus TV. Paul. Go ahead, Paul.
All right. Good morning to you, Prime Minister.
Good morning, sir.
Aviation. Okay, so my first question, I think you kind of touched it, but I just wanted to be clear on why the IDATA rejected Lisa's plans to reopen the airport. Is it because they believe our mitigating measures, those that were suggested, that they were not satisfactory?
Well, I repeat that the letter is written by a Mr. David Hernandez. And when I read the letter, it is clear to me that there is some confusion, perhaps because of his unfamiliarity, or his not being principally an English speaker. What he said in part is this: we understand the need for the Belizean authorities to adopt measures that would mitigate health risks in the country. However, we are concerned of an eventual mandatory request to present proof of a negative COVID-19 result either prior to boarding or upon arrival in Belize. IATA supports testing when scalable, accurate, and fast results are available. That's not the case with the PCR. Testing at the start of the travel process would create a sterile travel environment that would reassure travelers and governments. And it seems, therefore, they're requesting that those sorts of sanitary requirements await the arrival of the tests that are scalable, accurate, and fast, which would allow either the airlines to do it pre-boarding or for us to do it after the passengers disembark. Rest assured that IAT is fully committed to working together with the government, blah, 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 but that's the essence of what was said. So my understanding from that is not no, because the PCR tests, which are the only reliable ones, are not scalable. They've not been able to, in fact, produce mass, easy testing access in the United States. And so our requirement that travelers come with having taken such a test and with a negative result would impose some, I don't know if hardships is the word, but would cause the travelers to have to go through the processes in the US to get such a test. And I repeat that the access to those tests differs wildly from state to state. In some counties, you can't get the test at all except you are exhibiting symptoms. That seems to be an outlier. But even where you can get the test, it seems that there is a wait period of perhaps 5 to 10 days, and then some of the testing sites will not give you it in writing. They might put it via an online portal. You can request in those cases that they send you a written report, but then they mail that, and that adds another 4 or 5 days to the already 5 to 10 day process. So there are those difficulties, and when we looked at what's happening in Dade and Broward County, in Los Angeles County, it appeared that it was rather easier, certainly in those three counties. New York, perhaps not so much. The fact is, though, that we recognized from the start that the imposition of that requirement would mean that the tourists would have to jump through some hoops in order to be able to come to Belize. And we thought it might provide a little bit of a dampener, but we imagined that people are so cooped up, the pent-up drive to get out and to come to Belize, which is one of the greatest tourist attractions in the world, would be such that those difficulties tourists would be willing to engage with and overcome those difficulties. Whether our notion would have proven right or wrong is now academic, because the airlines themselves, presumably guided by IATA, the airlines have said we're not going to come in those circumstances. But believe me, we tried. I can read out for you what our ambassador had to say, what the various consulates had to say. There have been persons in the tourism industry here. There's one particular gentleman who is a medical doctor, an American, with whom I've been in contact the entire weekend and right up until yesterday evening. He's been checking with his people in the States, all in an effort to see if there is any way we can reach out to a pool of persons and market to them who would be able to get the tests perhaps a little more quickly than is the norm. And we've not given up. It is just that I cannot in conscience say to you July 1, because as things now stand, we have to get over this particular hump are constituted by the position taken by IATA and the airlines before we can come back to you and say, all right, we're good to go. It's July 15th or it's August 1st or whatever it may be.
No, so basically, IATA agrees with your initial position, which which was lacking in the market testing. You mentioned something about if our airlines willing to make the flights, that is another option. Can you that you mentioned?
Well, right. Let me just say here, study raises, I'm reading from something I got from the internet. Study raises questions about false negatives from quick COVID-19 tests. The FDA issued the alert on the Abbott test in the spirit of transparency. In a press release, the agency said it's investigating whether the false negative results could be connected to the type of swabs used in the test or the material the samples are stored in for transport. It also cautions that any negative test results that are not consistent with a patient's clinical signs and symptoms or necessary for patient management should be confirmed with another test, just to make the point that there are these difficulties that have arisen empirically with the rapid tests. But I repeat, you're talking about Abbott Labs, you're talking about Roche, you're talking about these huge multilateral, multinational labs and medical equipment development facilities. I cannot believe that it's going to be at all long before they get it right. They are halfway there, perhaps more than halfway there. And so I hope springs eternal, and I certainly have every confidence that this is going to come on stream sooner rather than later. And that's what IATA wants, and that's what it appears the airlines want.
And that goes across the board for all airlines. I take it because you mentioned earlier that if there are airlines willing to make the trip, you guys will. Yeah.
Oh, we'd be
good to go. The thought arose that perhaps out of Canada, I saw something about a lab in Canada that seems to be very close to, in fact, confirming that their test ticks all the right boxes. But in the meantime, Canada, I think, is our second largest source market for tourism. If there are ways to put on dedicated Belize charter flights from Canadians that would be perhaps able to obtain rather more easily than Americans tests and test results, we'd be good to go. There are still some protocols we want to put in place at the airport, but we can do those very quickly. So I'm glad you're asking this sort of question, because it gives me an opportunity to emphasize that what has happened is, in my view, a temporary setback, not any reason for any loss of hope, rather a spur for us to try even harder and to explore every possible angle so that we can get back on track to a fixed opening date as fast as possible. And meantime, if there is any chance we could drum up some charter business, we absolutely will pursue that chance relentlessly. I have the complete cooperation of the Belize Tourism Board and the tourism sector. When we were going back and forth, not I, but Mrs. Bevans and her people, back and forth with the airlines, with the people in Antigua, with the people in the Bahamas, with the people in St. Lucia, with our people in the States. There are leading lights in the tourism industry that was very much engaged with Mrs. Bevans, trying to see how we could make this happen. So there is no doubt but that there is a will. The tourism industry is divided. There are those who say, you people, when that report came out, whoever circulated that purported NOC report and said that we are going to reopen July 1. There was, I won't call it a deluge, but there was a great deal of blowback from members of the industry, saying, are you people crazy? Don't you freaking open any airport on July 1st? We've come too far in terms of the progress we've made in containing COVID-19 to take that sort of a risk. But of course, they didn't know, because the so-called report didn't make clear, that we would only secure July 1st if there was agreement to the principal health safeguard we were putting in place. Even with that, it is my sense that there are those in the industry. Just this morning, I had some messages from one member of the oversight committee. The oversight committee's decision was not unanimous. I'm not going to say who voted how, but just to make the point that this is a real live issue, that's a conundrum, that's perplexing, and any way you call it, you're going to have those who will say, excellent call, and you're going to have those who will say, you are an absolute idiot to make such a call. But that's the nature of this crisis that's gripping us. We were perfectly prepared on the basis of that requirement for the test results to go with it, despite whatever blowback we would have faced. And I'm saying that I thank you again for your question, because it gives me a chance to expound on the fact that we've not just given up and we've not just said, well, let's simply sit and be inactive and wait for the development of the satisfactory rapid test. No, let us explore all those angles that might perhaps see us drumming up some business, however minimal, so that at least the optics could be there and we could say, well, the PGIA is open. Not many airlines are coming, not many flights are coming, but it is open. We continue to work hard towards that.
Can we then say that perhaps some persons in the industry are somewhat satisfied with the view that the domestic tourism or push has been bringing to the industry? Has any assessment been done to determine what kind of view there is domestic tourism as part of over the past 2 weeks?
I know that people were very pleased. Mrs. Bevans sent me some comments she had from some hoteliers who were booked solid through the long Commonwealth Day weekend. One said there, in fact, his hotel is booked out again for this weekend, although I gather now that there is some weather, there are weather conditions we're going to be facing this weekend, and booked out solid again for next weekend. The problem was nothing is happening during the weeks. And in any event, that was a welcome little fillip, but it cannot be any kind of a substitute. It can't even begin to approach being a substitute for the international tourists, which are really our lifeline. But every mickle makes a muckle, every little bit helps. And so indeed, within that limited sort of context, within those limited contours, the domestic tourism push so far has been a success.
Prime Minister, last week or the week before, where we received word that the decision was made by your ministry to carry out the general cut of monthly expenditures across all ministries. As a result, the disbursement of funds for expenditure in the ministry will now be given out in on 20th track per se instead of on 12. What are some of the services under ministries across the board that will be affected, or how does these ministries go about identifying priority services, that must stay information?
That's a large question, and indeed, your last point, it really is a ministry by ministry assessment. We have to leave it to the ministries to try to prioritize. And of course, as things begin to improve, as collections hopefully start to recover, I think the May collections, which relate to the April month, will no doubt be the lowest ever. But I believe as from next month, as from June, collections will start to inch up because we're lifting a lot of the restrictions on the internal economy. But as we go forward, still, even if there's some relief from that 1/20th as opposed to 1/12th monthly transfer, it won't be especially significant. So the question of austerities, the question of stringencies will remain very much with us. But I repeat that it has to be that ministry by ministry, together, the minister, the CEO, the administrative personnel, all staff, look at the picture and decide where, in fact, the cuts can not most easily. That would be framing it completely wrongly. Which cuts will cause the least or less hardship? But for me, the panorama is so wide. I could hardly begin to tell you what will happen with the individual ministries.
Can it be argued, however, that if a service is affected, then perhaps employees and their positions and their roles and tasks may also be affected as a result of their jobs?
It can so be argued, but I certainly am not looking to countenance that sort of an argument. No, at all. As I said, I am hopeful that we will begin to see an uptick in collections, and that while we will not get back to full strength anytime soon, there would certainly still be enough services being carried on by the individual ministries that there will be no need to fire anybody. We've already said there are to be no new hires. A position goes vacant, you don't fill it. And certainly for contract officers, your contract expires, you can't get it renewed, except in particular circumstances. I talked about the need not to stop the infrastructure projects because they're being funded from abroad, and so we get the foreign exchange, they create jobs. But in a lot of those cases, supervisors at the Ministry of Works' project execution unit are specialized persons, engineers with qualifications that are not easily come by. They usually are employed on contract. You can see where if that sort of a contract expires, there may well be a need to renew because we can't easily replace such a person from the pool of others currently employed. But subject to that sort of exception, we will be cutting back. There will be no question of, as I said, filling posts that become vacant. There will be no question of new hires. And I think moving in that way, and once the uptick, however small it is, does take place, there ought to be work to keep everybody employed. I don't want to actually say, well, it doesn't matter. I'm simply not going to fire anybody, because it's a fair question you ask. If there's no work to be done, then why are we paying this huge wage bill? but I don't think we've reached that point yet, sir.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, we'll now move to Love FM. Renee, I know you have a 12:30 deadline, so you can go ahead. No, it's Renee. Renee, go ahead.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good morning, Wayne.
Okay, so in terms of economics, now I know you said that you're looking at, we can't open the borders, we can't open the airport, but we need some social economics. So I look also is one of the aspects that we have. Are we perhaps looking at foreign exchange or public tourism? See what other earlier this week, for example, we spoke about the event, a story on pineapple preparation for exports, and this is kind of where we are in the industry. Are there any opportunities that will happen?
Well, sorry.
And on the use of that, could you also give us an update on the cattle exportation?
A number of things, Renee. Remember that there is already in place a sort of economic recovery or business continuity committee. It's made up of a subset of the people who constitute the National Task Force, and it has representation certainly from the Chamber of Commerce as well as from other social partners. So they are in the process of producing their first report, which I'm sure will greatly assist. But even before that, you're right, you talked about the need to try to identify perhaps fresh sources of foreign exchange, and you spoke about the pineapple story. Well, something that I prompted Cabinet on this last Tuesday's meeting, I think can take off. In fact, I was told that already pilot projects are in existence, and that is the hemp industry. I mean, this hemp thing is huge globally. We've now amended the SI to define hemp as the plants, the product that have a THC content of 0.3% or lower, because that is what the US requires in terms of their legislation. In Canada, it's different. It's up to 1%. But the bottom line is hemp is huge, and if we can get that hemp production going, and either well, there are two models. There are some who want to actually process the hemp in Belize. There are others who just want us to export the product and have the processing done in Canada or whatever. Naturally, I would favor the first model. But in all cases, people aren't talking about coming in to invest and trying to do the growing, the production themselves. They're talking about trying to employ farmers, in particular small farmers, to give them the throughput. But that's an excellent example of one way in which we can push and thereby realize some additional foreign exchange earnings. I am sure that there are others. The thing is with the hemp that my understanding is you can move pretty quickly on that. But right, CPBL is looking at expanding the line of products that are pineapple based. We know the coconut industry was poised for some kind of a takeoff. Bottom line is, Renee, you're absolutely correct. There is a need now to try to scale up with other basically non-traditional activities for export that can help to earn us some new foreign exchange sources.
As a follow-up to that, sir, could you give us a clearer picture in terms of where we are?
Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, Renee. You asked me about cattle, and I forgot to answer that. If you don't mind, where we are with that, when last I heard, the export to Guatemala seems to be almost in the bag. We needed, of course, to have the animals go through a quarantine process, not for COVID-19, but for the diseases that normally are a fare in terms of the export of live animal. So both from Mexico and from Guatemala, it appears that the interest to purchase live animals from Belize is strong, is being maintained. Guatemala should be off to a quicker start because the quarantine period that the Guatemalan importers or Guatemalan authorities required is coming to an end, I believe, this weekend. So that should be able to start in the next week or so. The Mexican quarantine process and the animals to go to Mexico are being quarantined at Blue Creek, I believe. The ones for Guatemala must be, I think, more in the Spanish lookout area. But both trading arrangements should get underway fairly soon, with the trade to Guatemala coming even before the trade to Mexico.
Okay, great. Could you give a clearer picture in terms of where we are with foreign reserves or foreign exchange? I asked because yesterday we got a memo from Atlantic Bank that's looking to reduce credit card limits for its customers, referencing foreign exchange and what have you.
Well, I don't have the exact figures here as to what the foreign assets of the individual commercial banks are. But roughly speaking, it is my understanding that we have at least another couple of months to go before the commercial banks would be close to running completely out of foreign exchange. If and when we get to such a point, then of course we have to turn to our central bank reserves. I repeat that we have some plans as to how we can attract some additional foreign exchange from abroad. I don't want to get into the details of those plans at this juncture for fairly obvious reasons. We're not quite there yet, and we don't want to give away what we're up to. But I assure you, in the most sincere and transparent fashion possible, that we do have a plan. And so I can say that there is no way the country will completely run out of foreign exchange. No way we will get even close to that before the end of the year. And I have to feel that with that kind of a window, we can meanwhile restart tourism, make the sort of push in new enterprises that you have touched on, Renee. So I don't see that, in fact, we are ever going to hit rock bottom. Of course, in the meantime, we have to conserve. The banks have to cut back. We have to start looking at only allowing foreign exchange to persons and businesses for essential imports. But basically, we're not anywhere close to a position where we would run out, so that not even the essential imports can in fact be purchased from abroad.
Okay, understood. Sticking again to finances and banking, we know that the local banks had extended some 3-month moratorium for people who either suffered pay cuts or became unemployed. That 3 months will expire shortly. Will the government be appealing to the local banks to perhaps extend that considering that we're not really seeing a change in restoring salaries or having the unemployed employed anytime soon?
Yes, absolutely. Again, I don't know that we can oblige the banks, but they have been very cooperative in the first instance. I certainly get the sense that they are absolutely willing to help. Of course, there's a limit to how far they can go. They must and that are perfectly prepared to entertain a shrinkage of their bottom line, but they don't want themselves to have to go out of business. So there are limits, but within those limits, absolutely, the central bank was the one that liaised with them initially, interfaced with them to make this happen, and the central bank continues to be in everyday touch with those banks on particularly the question of foreign exchange, but on the question of banking generally. So there is no doubt that an effort will be made to see if some sort of extension of the forbearance can be had from the commercial banks.
And one final question for my PM. With the regulations and precautionary measures for COVID-19, social distancing and having to wear a mask in public, and with the recent spike in crime, there is a concern, a public concern, in terms of where we are headed with criminals being able to use these masks and what have you to carry out their activities. Could you comment on that, sir? Because it is a national concern and a national issue.
Well, I can see that, but I don't think we're at a point where we can say for that reason you don't have to wear masks. The very tragic, senseless execution style murder of the Chinese businessman. It's not my sense that the perpetrator wore a mask. He did? Okay, well, I'm sorry about that. But I stand corrected, but still, I don't, that cannot be a reason, excuse me, that cannot be a reason for us to drop the requirement for the wearing of a mask in public, especially when you're entering business houses and are going to be in some form of a crowd. I'm sorry, but it's one of these irreconcilables, and the police will simply have to continue to try their best to deal with what now appears to be an incipient new spike in crime, but I can't see that an aid to that must be the dropping of the requirement to wear masks.
Thank you, Renee. We'll now move to Kami from CTV3. Are you there? Oh, she's not there. Okay, we'll go ahead with Tony Jimenez.
Good afternoon. Prime Minister, I need to. No? Yes, we're hearing you, sir. I need to chip a little on all the questions and the sort of follow-up. Jules spoke about education and sort of the spirit of opening up our schools. My question really is who goes into if the government is able financially to open schools and about that thinking how that would it be necessary already
for their and then new budget is also in order to do that. Also, the the 120th as opposed to 12, we choose a different part. Does that affect education? And for the Ministry of Finance to use a number 120 was really a new budget for him to be able or for to be able to meet that qualification.
I don't think so, sir, not at all.
The decision to, in fact, do the transfers on that 1/20th rather than 1/12th a monthly basis came about as a matter of the reality of falling revenues. But generally, I have already said that we're more likely than not going to have to go back to the National Assembly to pass a new budget, a budget that will be far different from the one we passed at the end of March, a budget that will be extremely lean, a budget that will see us ratify the cuts to the bone that are already taking place. So that's very likely to happen, and that's a valid question. But in the meantime, no, there's nothing to stop the Financial Secretary from controlling and restricting the transfers to the particular ministries. Your problem normally with budgeting, is when you spend too much, when you spend more than is budgeted for, and the question of whether you need to get authorization for that. There's nothing to stop you from spending less, especially in a situation like this where it is obligatory. As to the question of whether we can afford to reopen schools, of course we can. There are lots of other expenses, but the basic thing is salaries. And remember, when we talk about public officers and not cutting their pay, we're including teachers. With the government schools, we pay everything. With the grant-aided schools, the schools that are run by the various denominations, I think we pay 80% of the salaries. So when I speak in general terms about not firing any public officer and about not cutting the pay of any public officer, I'm also talking about the teachers, sir. On that basis, of course, we can reopen schools. There will be some difficulties. For example, some of these discretionary monies that we employ for the high school subsidies, we're going to look and see how much of that we can continue to afford. The question of school runs and the payment of buses to transport the children, we're going to have to see how there can be some compression, some merger, things like that. I'm not telling you that it will be as it was before, but the basic answer to your question is absolutely yes. We can afford to reopen schools, and the only reason we have not so far reopened schools is because of the health situation and our view that the pandemic is not yet under control to the extent where we can afford to put the children back into the crowded classrooms. Certainly, that's inevitably going to happen come the start of the new school year, barring some dramatic new development.
One of the probably the most reviled part of the regulations to the state of emergency is the use of the face mask. You have already spoken to them. I just want to ask for you to comment on something. When we go to a hurricane or whatever, whenever he is on the request, we ask that people listen to local um, Bureau. In terms of the mask, do you think that Indians have been educated enough for them to continue using the mask, seeing and hearing that we're COVID-free?
Yes, I think so.
I think there is almost that daily Ask the Experts program. I think there is reference by all authorities to what the science is, what the prescriptions of the World Health Organization and even the CDC in the States. I see Governor Cuomo just made it a law in New York for people to wear their masks. Now, they're not free of active cases as we are. But I think Belizeans are understanding. They see that we've tried to ease up. One time you used to have to exercise with your mask. That is no longer so. And you can exercise now any time of the day during non-curfew hours. That's sort of a relief. You can now go to the beach. Clearly, when you are going to swim, you don't swim with your mask. So no man, I think our people have been very good, have been very understanding. Of course, there are exceptions, but by and large, that now overused term, we're all in this together, certainly rings true in this country. And I don't accept your use of the word reviled at all in terms of your description of how Belizeans feel about this face masks. I accept that they know it is a bother, but they understand that that is the part of the price we pay to remain COVID-free or remain COVID inactive.
Given that the curfew is part and parcel of the virus, and the change in time Fridays and Saturdays by 1 hour, there seems to be some thought that maybe the hour should be brought up in the morning, 4 o'clock, especially given that a lot of industry happens in the city, and if buses leave until 6 o'clock, then there is a shorter start-up time. So could it be that, was there any thought of bringing it up to 4 o'clock so that buses can actually start moving out from 5?
Sir, the question of the curfew is under continuing review. As it is, you have to concede that even if you think it a baby step, a step was taken to offer some relief in terms of extending the hours on weekends. But it is something that we revisit pretty much on a weekly basis. And as we continue along this trajectory of further opening up in our effort to reach the point of complete liberation, if I can use that term, I am sure that you will see further changes made to the curfew rules.
As a last question, and a while ago you alluded to November as being your last time hope that tourism can open up. Coincidentally, at that time, Belize should be having an election. Is elections a part of your thinking also?
Absolutely not, sir. I cannot be bothered, or not bothered, maybe that's the wrong word. I cannot afford to be focusing on the question of elections. This crisis, this pandemic, in fact, obliges the concentration of all my energies, and I would think that's more or less the case with all the leaders in this country, requires a concentration of effort and energies on how to continue to manage the crisis successfully, and how to, in fact, begin to promote the recovery. The question of a November latest date reopening of tourism has to do principally with the fact that that's the start of the high season, and we cannot afford to miss the high season. There are those in the tourism industry who weren't sold on this July 1st reopening, and one of the reasons they gave was that this is slow season in any event, so how many people are likely to come, especially since there's still that US global level 4 travel advisory. But that is what figures most in my thinking when I say that November is the outermost limit. That is the start of high season, and we cannot afford to let high season start without our being open for business. I repeat that I wish, hope, and expect that we will reopen long before November. And I leave it there, sir.
Thank you very much. And finally, we'll have Maricela Maya. You're up.
Good afternoon, Marisol. I'm glad to see that they left the best for the last.
Other people will take umbrage with that, sir.
Well, I'm sure they'll accept it in the spirit in which I said.
I want to start with the matter of like bills, which many customers are seeing coming higher than usual, and I know the company has said it has to do with the time of the year, which is hotter, but I believe some feel that it also has to do with people being at home more. Is there any commitment that can be looked at if there is non-payment by customers whose employment has been affected, that they're liable to be put out?
Well, I said right at the start that with respect to BEL, we have to concede that they're different from BTL and from BWSL in this sense. Well, none of them, I suppose, is completely the master of its own destiny. But to the extent that there are external forces that fundamentally affect the operations of the public utilities, BEL is the most extreme example of this. Remember that they are only distributors of energy. They're not producers of energy. So they have to absorb the cost of power. They buy the power principally from CFE in Mexico, and from local producers, including, of course, the hydro, Fortis. But so there is an extent to which they are prisoners of that cost of power. Now, you said that the company has already indicated that the reason for the climb in the electricity bills is, logically enough, the summer heat and more people being at home. In terms of bricks that BL can cut to the consumers, subject to, as I said, there being a limit because they have to pay for the cost of power, and consumers already owe them, I think, in excess of $50 million. Subject to that, though, I understood BL right at the start to have said, look, we will be very careful with the way we handle this matter, and it will not be a sort of first resort action to disconnect somebody for non-payment. It clearly, on the other hand, doesn't mean that. It clearly, on the other hand, does not mean that you cannot pay and not pay and not pay, despite your circumstances, and that BEL's forbearance can continue indefinitely. But they are disposed to try and work with people as much as possible, and that's the best that I can say. We're not hearing you. Oh,
Thanks for that. No, I was trying to unmute. For this next question, PM, I ask your indulgence because it contains a lot of examples and it refers to stage in government. I think looking at everything that's happening, many Belizeans want this to be a continuation of business as usual. So apart from what has already surfaced, are there plans for an across-the-board exercise to trim back within the public service? And so some of the examples that I'm aware of, for instance, you have customs officers who make more overtime than is humanly possible. You spoke about contract officers or public servants still being hired specifically when it comes to infrastructure projects, but we got word that during this period there were some contract officers who were brought on.
You've cut out.
Like clerks. I think it would have been under 20, and this happened even after the FinTech circular, that this should no longer be allowed during this crisis period. There's also the issue of the movement of offices, I should say, from where they are to other rented buildings. And there's one example I have in relation to Marbe and the IBT registry that moved out of their old space into the Keystone building with the understanding that the rent would be less, but that has not happened. And the other example, which I think everyone knows about, is the wastage when it comes to the use of vehicles for the government.
Well, first of all, in terms of the question of overtime, the circle, I don't know if you're talking about customs officers making this heap of overtime before the circular from the financial secretary was in fact published. But there is a circular now that says that overtime must be limited to 20 hours. So let's be aware of that, and let's then police what is happening to make sure that there is compliance. Generally, on the question of wastage, I don't think a soul will deny that there is always room for improvement. To some extent, enforced contraction or reduction of wastage is the norm, because if you're not getting the monies to pay for additional fuel, you're not getting the monies to pay for additional travel and subsistence, you're not getting the monies to pay for overtime, that will go some way in helping to contain wastage. But again, like the poor, some degree of wastage will always be with us. It's unfortunate, and of course, the public will be the best place to police the sorts of things. I believe that the Public Service Union is offering some sort of incentive for people to video circumstances that clearly would constitute instances of wastage on the part of public officers. and that sort of thing should and could help, and is to be commended. So the bottom line is, even with COVID-19 and the enforced stringencies, there will not be perfection ever, but I believe and hope that you will see a tremendous degree of containment of the kind of wastage that people have grown accustomed to complaining of insofar as the operations of GOB are concerned.
So then that means there won't be any consideration to the cost saving committee, like a more concerted effort than just having the people videoing government vehicles.
No, the cost saving committee, no man, they, as part of the exchange with the unions, it was agreed that the cost savings committee should be functional, should be active, and that I can't get into the details, I don't even recollect them, but what I saw, there were some excellent ideas, and we agreed in the meeting I had with them that those ideas are to be implemented, and that the committee should be active, should not only continue in existence, but should be active to ensure the implementation of the measures, those of the measures that they have proposed that that government clearly is in agreement with.
Okay, and I think one of the situations that exist within government that I think has gained a lot of interest from the public has to do with the entertainment allowance. And the report is that some public officials, and that would go all the way up to ministers, are still charging their respective departments and ministries, which means that that could amount to some type of double dipping. That's something that would also be looked at.
Charging their ministries for what? I'm not following. Ministers are charging.
When they entertain, speaking specifically about the entertainment allowance, because that's for when they have business people over that they take out to dine to discuss proposals, whatever the case may be. There is the report that some of these officers still charge their ministries, even though that allowance is supposed to be used for that specific purpose.
Well, I know, and I've already said that, remember, ministers have given up half of their housing and telephone allowance. I'm not aware of any entertainment allowance per se. I wouldn't know, because I don't want to blow my own horn, but as you know, I get absolutely nothing, no salary, no kind of allowance. Given that up completely over the period of the next few months. That's a tidy amount. But if there is, in fact, abuse in terms of ministers going out to have meals or going out for drinks, and in fact charging, putting the tab or putting the charges on the ministry's tab, then finance officers and people like that must complain and let the Ministry of Finance know what's going on, so we can put a stop to it. I entirely agree with you. That's not to be countenanced at any time, and especially not at this time, where all of us are expected to engage in savings and in cutting back. So I entirely agree with you.
The other question has to do with land. I think with this crisis, and it's not only in Canada, but I think all across the world, it's brought land ownership into focus. And there was a call before to engage landowners who are not up to date with their taxes, and you could call them absentee landowners, probably not doing anything with their land. I think some people are calling for leadership to make this a more equitable process, so that it's not only the money people who would actually have access to land and they can begin growing their own food.
I'm not quite sure what you mean. In terms of land that remains idle, we've talked for a while about the speculation tax. We've certainly had a report commissioned. I think I may have seen it already. It may have been finished. I think Mrs. Fairweather, the ex-commissioner of lands, is doing it in terms of proposing a more equitable and more effective land tax system. When we would be able to debate that in Parliament and pass it is another matter. I'm not quite sure if I'm answering the questions that you are asking. I hope I am, but if not, perhaps you can give me a little bit more detail of exactly what it is you want to focus in on.
Then I guess you'd want to make a comment as to the new push and movement for the acquisition of land that's happening at Mile Park 4, because the numbers that came out there are very telling. People want land.
Well, I understand that, but Mr. Petillo is trying to do a repeat performance of what happened at Harmonyville, in my view, is not to be tolerated. Even though I don't know that Harmonyville ever ended up in any equitable distribution among needy people of the entirety of the land that was acquired. In this case, you are talking about land that's not government land. I hear that the private owners of the land have already secured legal and other representation and have served notice that the attempt to, as it were, acquire by force their lands will not be tolerated. There are legal recourses that they will obviously have. I think government certainly is going to stay out of it, except to the extent that we have a duty to preserve law and order and we have a duty to enforce court orders. It's not a matter for us. It's not land that's owned by government. So I will content myself with saying we will do what we need to do, and we certainly do not approve of the methods of Mr. Petillo, even if we can sympathize with the fact that there is always a cry on the part of people for a chance to be able to own their own piece of land.
And then the last thing has to do with crime and I guess security forces, and it's in relation to the situation involving the Chinese Belizeans that were found fishing down south. The understanding we got is the Coast Guard believed that these people, the group of people, because there was a link up with a Guatemalan vessel from whom they said they were purchasing from Guatemalan some jumbo shrimp. There was contact there, may have been contact there, and Coast Guard thought they would be placed under quarantine. They weren't. The suspicion is that there was some higher up involvement, and if there was, then that would speak to a double standard, one that we cannot resist in a situation like this where we're talking about the possibility of people catching a virus. And I think the other, well, I think it's separate, but I'm just going to ask it, and that will be the last one, has to do with the idea out there that the curfew is assisting with the crime, holding it down, and that's one of the reasons why it is being kept or enforced still.
Oh, I wouldn't deny that last one at all. I think it's a question of our getting a bit of extra bounty by keeping in place the curfew, which is principally and which was generated in consequence of the need to restrict movement because of COVID, trying to contain the spread of COVID, but undoubtedly a byproduct has been certainly containment of gang-related activity, particularly in Belize City, and gang-related murders, and that the need or the desire to maintain that sort of relief figures in the deliberations of the National Oversight Committee and the Cabinet is not to be denied. I plead guilty, speaking for myself. I plead guilty if you accuse me of being one that wants to see the curfew maintained for as long as possible as an aid to crime fighting. I plead guilty. Throw myself on your mercy so that the punishment might not be harsh, but I do have to plead guilty. On a serious note, in terms of the earlier question you asked, absolutely, if the decision not to quarantine the people that the Coast Guard apprehended or stopped was made because of some improper involvement of a higher up in the Ministry of Health, that is to be deplored. But I don't know that that is so. My understanding, which no doubt is limited, I don't claim to be particularly au fait or familiar with the circumstances, but my understanding is that the decision was made by the Director of Health Services that in the circumstances, any possible contact was absolutely minimal and that there was therefore no need for the persons to be placed in quarantine. I have, as I think most of us do, tremendous respect for the Director of Health Services, and so I would have to be guided by his decision. I would have to say that I firmly believe that he knows what he's doing, and that such a decision made by him was a decision honestly come by. I don't see him as the kind of person that would allow himself to be influenced by any kind of political or other considerations. So I will have to rest with that if DHS made that decision, then I have to assume that it was a proper and well-made decision.
Thank you, Marisol. That now concludes today's virtual press conference.
Isani wasn't?
No, Isani had waived his questions. He said all these questions were answered. Again, that concludes today's virtual press conference. Tune in tomorrow to Ask the Experts with the Honorable Attorney General, and he will be further explaining the new relaxed measures to the statutory instrument in the state of emergency at 3 p.m. on the Government of Belize Facebook page. Thank you very much. Have a nice day all.
Thank you.